Not a while ago, somebody asked me, might I have some bullet systems or for faster time controls against Caro Kann because it's pretty difficult to crack. So I opted for the Goldman variation. It begins with e4, c6, knight c3, d5, and queen to f3. Quite an interesting one, I have to admit. When I was preparing for this one, I was pretty surprised that Firuzia used it a couple of times in the last couple of months. MVL, I faced it a couple years ago when I played Caro Kann myself against Nigel Short, and recently Naroditsky played like a whole bunch of games with white pieces. All these guys are just typical proof that this is something that is very modern and good. So what's the point? After queen f3, what happens when they push d4? You just play bishop c4. That's the point. You attack the pawn on f7, and that's the trick. They can't take on c3 because you play queen f7, take d takes c3, and afterwards with the bishop f4 and rook to d1, this king is going to find itself in a very, very severe, under severe attack, and this is like completely winning for white. But quite an interesting thing happens if they play knight f6. Then you have to bring your knight back to e2, and you now threaten e5 to win either pawn on f7 if they move it somewhere, or if they play knight a5 to win the pawn on d4. So they have to go with knight bd7 to prevent that. In case they go with e5, you just play d3, and afterwards find a place for this queen on g3, or play knight g3, knight f5. After knight bd7, they threaten to jump on e5. You always have to play bishop b3 in these positions. It's important to keep the bishop. Keeping the light square bishop is probably one of the most important things here. So when they play e5, d3, I'll show you two games. Iskandarov against Popov. In that game was a5. This guy just wanted to harass this. Bishop a3, h5, playing on the wings. Bishop a2, placing the bishop in the shelter, and playing g4. Such an important move, taking advantage of the fact that the rook on h1 was defended. As soon as he played g4, he was better. This guy played queen e7 because obviously g5 was a threat and f7 was weak. And after that, queen e7, h3, queen g2, and broke with f4. In position like this, with these bishops, with the idea of knight f3, where he just has a nice possibility to play a longer short castle, white was much better. In case they go knight c5, when after the light square bishop, queen g3, attacking the pawn on e5, and kind of pressuring this pawn on g7. It's interesting that Matthias Blubaum a few months ago on the web in some of these blitz tournaments played knight takes b3. Firuzia captured, and after that he just exchanged, and he was clearly up. Opponent won this game very easily. I just analyzed this and tried to see what's the problem if queen c7. Probably he was aware of that, and after knight f3 he just realized that he cannot keep the pawn on e5, because in case of knight takes a takes, pawn on g7, just like the pawns on d4 and e5, they're just hanging. But there is another thing and another problem here. If you play knight after d7, boom, knight d4, and you take advantage of the pinned queen on c7. A fairly nice one, and I like this one a lot. So just because of this, after bishop c4, most of these guys play e6. e6 is nice because it's like, according to Capablanca rule, put the pawns on the color in the middle games of the opponent's bishop. And maybe they do this here, but at the same time they just close the light square bishop as well. So knight c on e2, c5, d3, knight c6, queen g3. One of the good games that I played in this opening in the past went like this. So in case of any h5, you just play h4, you don't care. There was one nice game where I won a game like that. In one game, the guy played g6, bishop d2, h4, and knight f3, and after castles, He just probably had to move this knight and push f4 and f5 afterwards. And in my game was knight f6, bishop d2. It's important to have this bishop d2 before you commit yourself with knight on f3. Why? My opponent played bishop d6. It's one of those French tricks where they give up the g7 pawn to play rook g8. In some scenarios, just to take the pawn back on g2. But in some other scenarios, they just want to go with, I don't know, some initiative while we just greedily picking up these pawns on the king's side. I played f4. I was threatening e5, and the guy played bishop e7. Once again, queen g7 comes as a very risky approach, and you just have to carry on developing yourself. So knight f3, castles, knight a5 makes very much sense. He just wants to somehow remove this monstrous bishop. That bishop decided the game in few moves. I decided to capture an a5, which is a little bit, like I like this move because it gives me a tempo for the attack, but it's always risky when you give up the bishop here and bishop that could be used afterwards in the attack. I played e5. Knight e5 to jump on e3. I saw what was I gonna do after I played e5. You should never allow your opponent to jump like this and get like strong dark squares, but in this specific case I realized when I played e5 that I had f5. I was threatening f6, I was threatening bishop d5 and f6, and he couldn't play anything but king h8. I took on d5 and played a very nice move, knight g5. Now I'm defending by rook on f1, pawn on f5, but at the same time, I just want to push f6. The guy played queen c7, I played f6, and when he captured, I sacrificed, absolutely crushing this king. So after queen h4, I just used my favorite rook lifting idea, and the guy resigned. Some Jason guy from Elite Chess. The guy was played in 2020, fairly good. A pretty interesting example of attack, and just like I told you, all these guys that I just mentioned on the beginning of the lesson, I'm talking about Firuzia, Naroditsky, MWL, all these guys are great tacticians, and also they're fantastic bullet players. They all use this in Katara, Open and Lead Chess. They used it on the web during the whole this Corona period during the 2020. So it's good for blitz games. And finally, apart from that d4, they can play other moves as well. For example, e6 makes one bad version of playing not a classical Caro Kann, not even a classical French. But on the other hand, what kind of queen is this on f3? Well, we're going to be able to take advantage better of this queen on f3 that they can use of this bishop on c8. And that's what I like, especially for these faster time controls, because queen on f3 can usually go on g3, g4, and just on the king side to do some tactical things. A quite interesting game I'm about to show you, where Naroditsky played in Katara Open, actually Katara Blitz tournament, actually Bullet tournament, sorry, against Firuzia himself. Firuzia also played this system, and now he had to face it against Naroditsky. Naroditsky played e4. This guy captured on e4. Interesting enough is if knight f6, it is going to transpose into the third move, knight f6, where you always have to play e5, and my specialty, knight h3, with the idea of knight g5. We're going to discuss this a few moments later. So after d takes, he has to play queen takes e4 to defend, and after knight f6, played queen h4. I like this queen. I like this queen because it's going to give you knight f3, bishop d3, bishop g5, with some very nasty tactical threats on the king side. That's exactly what happened in the game. Firuzia played bishop e7, knight f3, knight b7, and after b6, Naroditsky played queen g3. Quite a difficult position for Firuzia already. I like white's activity. I like now this queen on g3 and being on the king side, and eventually white won. Third move, knight f6. If third move, knight f6, you play e5, knight d7, and you play d4. They gotta play e6 themselves, and you play this really crucial move, knight h3. What I like about this knight h3 move is that you want to jump on g5 and literally win in 2 moves. In case of bishop e7, I'll show you, for example, instead of bishop e7 or doing stuff like this, they can just play like c5. But now we're just going back to some sort of held-on variation. Knight g5 threatening mate. They go queen e7, da-da-da-da, knight b5, followed by knight d6. They cannot defend all these weaknesses at the same time, so they can't play it. Can they play bishop e7? That's exactly what happened in game Naroditsky-Sadvani, played on Lee Chess 2020, queen g3. You can't play castles because of bishop h6. And when you play g6, boom, bishop h6. You can't play castle anymore. Your king will remain in the center. Any c5, I'll take d takes c5. I'll play knight g5, queen f4 to just optimize my attacks on the f7 square. And I want to play long castle afterwards. When they play h6 to prevent knight g5, knight f4. What for? Now you just want to go with the queen h5, believe it or not. And somebody said, is this going to be another opening where you're going to come up with some queen h5 ideas? Yes, you know how much I like it. Anyways, after c5, knight takes c6, you have queen h5, and if you like, you can go with this draw. I'm just saying if you like. Otherwise, you can just look for some other options. They usually play queen b6. Looks like this is a terrible center, and we absolutely neglected development, but now we have this queen h5. They can't take on d4 because you take on e6. They cannot take on e5 because you're going to swap off the queens and come up with fork. And when they play queen b6 to prevent this check, you just take on f8 and play bishop d3. I believe that I played once a bullet game like this, and of course with a bishop pair, with a good position, with a king being misplaced in the center, white is just so much better. And finally, if they play queen b6, queen h5, and if they go with g6, very interesting tactics is knight g6, queen g6, and then you just go with bishop d2 and f4. They can't touch this pawn. King gets stuck in the center. Yes, we're down a piece, but at the same time, they have terrible king. They have terrible development of all their pieces. And I'm willing to say that white has a great attacking chances. Worst case scenario, we just have a great compensation. And finally, in this pretty blitz or bullet lecture, they can also play d takes c4. That's the most common move in these positions. Then you just capture by knight, and now they have few options. I especially like the one when they play e6, trying to play hyper solid. Then you play b3, bishop b2, long castles, and then you just wanna, with knight h3, do this knight g5, g4, and stuff like this. In one game was h6, g4, knight f6, queen e2, queen d5, rook g1, and this now reminds me on the French with b3, an improved version where white just pushes all these pawns very easily. Rook took g5, queen f2, didn't want to exchange the queens, played rook to g1, took on c5. Okay, this guy obviously blundered this bishop, but already position was completely lost for black, and it was hardly defendable. If they play after knight e4 instead of e6 and b3, if they just go with knight f6, you go with bishop c4, so they can't take on e4 since the f7 is hanging. Knight bd7, I'll show you now. The only game that Naroditsky lost in that bullet tournament, playing against Carlsen, Carlsen played like this. So Carlsen knew his stuff. And I'm of opinion that if you bring your bishop back to b3 because he's threatening knight e5, you can keep certain advantage in your development, and afterwards to do d4. Naroditsky played d4. Magnus played knight b6. So what is he doing? He's attacking the bishop by knight on b6, and he's attacking the pawn. Naroditsky took on f6 and played bishop b3. I like more bishop d3 line, where you sack the pawn, go with knight e2, and then you go with castle. I analyzed this. I also found like a pretty good correspondence game played in this system, where after knight e4, queen f6, you're not supposed to exchange queens at all, you know, at any cost. So after bishop f5, bishop g5 captures, just like you see, white had a great initiative. It was quite an interesting game. The guy played queen g6 because he cannot easily complete development. Knight f4, took another pawn, and after this terrific tactical move, bishop e7 and queen g7, since they can't play long castle and short castle, and rook f to e1 was coming, white won this game in the next couple of moves. Really nice one, and it just shows you that black really has to know a lot if they want to play against this opening. Finally, when after knight d7, they do not allow you to go bishop c4 because of knight e5, and they just want to go with knight g on f6 or knight d on f6. Here I suggest, I'm just going to briefly suggest you like 4 plans. One of the most solid, and if you want to play this even in tournament chess, is d4. So when they play knight on f6, c3, knight e4, knight f6, and you put your queen on e5. It's hyper solid, white is tiny better, and you just have to be ready for something boring like an endgame like this, and you play knight f3. Slightly better, and play middle game, queenless type of middle game. In case they go bishop g4, you play bishop e2, take here, queen e2, knight f3, knight e5. They exchanged everything, and white just had a better game in a typical, I would say, a Caro Kann type of an endgame that is pretty boring and pretty difficult for, I would say, beginners or just medium level players. That's about d4. If you don't like d4, you can play queen e3, waiting for your opponent to be so smart and to make a pre-move, and then you say, come baby, and this is just a smarter mate. So they just have to play knight d on f6, in which case you play d3. An idea of d3, so they cannot take on e4 because you play d takes e4. Anything else, you just play normal g3, bishop g2, knight on f, or knight on f3 or knight on e2. What is maybe slightly better, but it's another option. And there is also an option with b3 that I like always in these positions. And here, they like this queen e5 move to stop bishop f5. And if they ever play e6, you're bringing your queen to g3, playing bishop d3, long castles if needed. And once again, you have these potentially very powerful bishops. It's pretty good and pretty annoying for black in faster time controls. And finally, apart from all these options, I would suggest one more, knight e2, so when they play like this, to play knight to c3. What is just tiny better, but black is very close to equalize it here. I would still say that this is okay, and just like you see, I gave you like a couple of interesting alternatives even against the main line. If you ask me what should you play, probably d4 or probably just move b3. Hope you enjoyed this short lecture, and hope you're gonna have so many nice wins, and just join the Butcher team on Lead Chess. And if you make some good blitz or bullet games, send the link there, and actually send it even on YouTube, and I'm gonna be glad. Bye guys.